The silence out here wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a presence. It had weight, pressing in on the cab of my truck, pushing against my eardrums. It was the silence of a dead planet, a vast geological quiet that had reigned for millennia and would continue for millennia after my brief, noisy life was extinguished. For 3 weeks, I'd been the only moving thing in the pan-flat immensity of the Utah high desert. My name is Elias Vance, and my job was to be lonely. As a geological surveyor for a large mining conglomerate, I was tasked with mapping mineral deposits in the most godforsaken corners of the country. I'd take readings, drill core samples, and log data. Living out of a specially outfitted F-350 that served as my office, kitchen, and bedroom. My only human contact was a crackly, twice-daily radio check-in with a man named Henderson, whose disembodied voice was my sole tether to a world that felt less real with every passing day. The landscape was a canvas of beige and ochre, stretching to a horizon so distant it blurred into the pale, washed-out blue of the sky. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down from that empty expanse, and the heat warped the air, creating shimmering mirages of water that my thirsty mind knew were lies. Loneliness was a physical thing, a constant companion. It sat in the passenger seat, stared back at me from the rearview mirror, and whispered doubts into my ear during the long, star-drowned nights. I was beginning to fray at the edges. The silence was starting to get inside. It was on the morning of my 23rd day that I saw it. I was driving towards a new survey grid, my tyres kicking up a plume of fine dust, when a shape on the horizon snagged my attention. It was wrong. In this world of gentle slopes and wind-eroded rock, it was a stark, vertical line, an error in the landscape. I pulled the truck to a stop, the engine's rumble dying and letting the great silence rush back in. I lifted my binoculars. The object was miles away, but even through the heat haze, its form was unnervingly clear. It was a tower, a slender black monolith that rose from the desert floor with perfect, geometric precision. It had no features that I could discern, no windows, no doors, no seams. It was just a shard of pure blackness stabbing into the sky. My first thought was that it was some kind of military installation, but it wasn't on any of my maps, not even the classified charts. There were no access roads, no fences, and no warning signs. It was simply there. A deep, instinctual wrongness crawled up my spine. It didn't belong. It felt less like it had been built, and more like it had been driven into the earth like a nail. Professional curiosity is a powerful, often foolish motivator. My job was to chart the unknown, and this was the most unknown thing I'd ever encountered. I spent the rest of the day approaching it, my truck crawling across the cracked earth. The closer I got, the more unsettling it became. The material it was made from wasn't rock or metal. It was a matte black that seemed to drink the sunlight, reflecting absolutely nothing. It was utterly seamless, as if carved from a single, colossal block of obsidian. Standing at its base, craning my neck back, I couldn't see the top. It just went up and up, disappearing into the glare of the sky. I walked the perimeter, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air around the tower was still and cold, a pocket of unnatural chill in the furnace of the desert. My compass, when I pulled it out, spun uselessly. My geological scanner, a device that could penetrate 100 feet of solid rock, returned only a screen of white noise. This tower was invisible to my technology. It was a void, a hole in the world. As I completed my circuit and returned to my starting point, I felt a low vibration through the soles of my boots. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a deep and resonating thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very core of the structure. It was slow, but powerful. And then, the wall in front of me changed. A perfect circle, 10 feet in diameter, began to dilate open. It wasn't a door sliding or retracting. The material itself seemed to pull back, like the iris of a vast, black eye. It was completely silent. The opening revealed a darkness that was somehow deeper and more absolute than the black of the wall. If I had to describe it, it was a hungry darkness. I should have run. I should have gotten in my truck and driven until my tires melted and my engine seized. Every survival instinct screamed at me to flee. But the silence, the mystery, the slow, hypnotic thump-thump from within, they held me fast. I was a scientist, an explorer. This was a discovery that would change the world. With my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the tower's slow pulse, I took a breath of the cold, sterile air wafting from the opening and stepped inside. The iris whispered shut behind me, sealing me in. The light from my headlamp was swallowed by the immense space. I was in a corridor that was as unnervingly perfect as the exterior. The walls, floor and ceiling were made of the same seamless, non-reflective black material. It stretched forward into the gloom, impossibly long and straight. The air was frigid and smelt of musty, ancient dust. The silence was total. My own breathing sounded like a storm, my footsteps like cannon shots. I walked for what felt like an hour, but my watch had stopped. Time had ceased to have meaning. Strangely, the corridor never turned, never branched. It was a perfect, infinite hallway. The only thing that changed was the ominous thump-thump that I could now hear more clearly. It was still distant, but it was the only landmark I had in this featureless geography. I walked towards the sound. I couldn't help it. Eventually, the corridor opened into a room. The chamber was so vast that my light couldn't find the walls or the ceiling. It was like standing at the bottom of a black ocean. In the center of this cavernous space, I found another corridor, and then another room. This one filled with thousands of small, identical black cubes, stacked in neat, towering rows. I touched one. It was cold and inert. I moved on, the thumping sound growing louder still. With every sound, it vibrated the air in my lungs. The architecture was a nightmare. I passed through rooms where the floor sloped at a dizzying 45-degree angle, forcing me to crab walk along the wall. I navigated a forest of thin black pillars that hummed with a low energy when I touched them. I crossed a bridge over a chasm so deep, my light found no bottom. The odd geometry of the place was a violation of logic, a physical manifestation of madness. And I was no longer alone. It started with seeing strange things at the very corners of my sight. Shadows that seemed to materialize from the darkness and circle around me. A brief, skittering sound that was not my own. I'd whip my head around, my light beam cutting through the air frantically, but there was never anything there. The tower was playing with me, using the unsettling silence and the disorienting spaces to peel back the layers of my sanity, one by one. I started talking to myself, my own voice a desperate anchor in the crushing emptiness. The thumping was deafening now, a resonant, wet beat that I could feel deep in my chest. The corridor I was in began to narrow, the ceiling lowering until I was forced to crouch. The walls were no longer smooth and dry. They were slick, with a cool, viscous fluid that clung to my fingers. The air was thick with a bizarre organic smell that I'd never encountered before. I crawled forward and emerged into the heart of the tower, the heart of the horror. I was on a ledge overlooking a spherical chamber. In the center of the chamber, suspended by a web of thick, pulsating, vein-like tendrils that burrowed into the walls, was the source of the sound. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was a heart. A colossal, living heart the size of my truck. It contracted and expanded with a sickening hydraulic power. Each beat, thump, thump, sending a shudder through the entire structure. The veins that held it throbbed with a dark, almost black fluid. I realized something at this point. I wasn't in a building. I was inside a creature. A vast, unknowable organism of stone and flesh. And I was a foreign body, a mere parasite in its gut. The realization broke me. A scream, frail and gut-wrenching, tore from my throat. It was a pathetic sound, instantly swallowed by the immense chamber, absorbed by the flesh-like walls. My terror was a drop of rain in the ocean of this thing's existence. But then, things got worse. It noticed me. The great heart faltered in its rhythm. For one terrifying moment, it was still. Then, it began to beat again, faster and faster, a frantic, panicked display of terror and rage. The sourceless, ambient lights that had filled the spaces flickered and died, plunging me into absolute, suffocating darkness. My headlamp was my only star in a universe of black. The building was awake, and it wanted me out. The ledge I was on began to tremble. The very architecture started to shift. I scrambled back into the narrow corridor I'd come from, just as the entrance convulsed and sealed shut. The walls around me began to constrict, groaning as they pressed in. I began to hyperventilate as I came to a terrifying conclusion. The tower, this thing, was trying to crush me, to digest me. Panic gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I ran, blind and clumsy, back the way I came. But the way I came no longer existed. The corridors were changing before my very eyes, reconfiguring themselves into a new, and deadlier tangle of dead ends. A straight hallway now led to absolutely nowhere. A vast chamber had shrunk to the size of a closet. The floor buckled and heaved beneath my feet, trying to throw me off balance. I screamed again, a full-throated roar of pure animal terror. The sound died the instant it left my lips, smothered by the animalistic walls. I could feel them now, pressing against my shoulders and my back. They were soft and yielding, like muscle. The organic smell that I noticed earlier was now completely overwhelming. It seemed I was going to die here. My body would be crushed, my bones ground to powder, my substance absorbed into this living nightmare. My last moments would be of darkness, pressure, and a solitude so profound it was its own form of extinction. No one would ever know what happened. My truck would be found, empty. I'd be another ghost story for the desert. This thought gave me a final, desperate surge of adrenaline. I would not be food. I would not be forgotten. I pushed myself through a narrowing gap, the slick walls scraping my skin, and fell into a familiar space. The first long corridor. It was shrinking, the far end a rapidly closing circle of grey light. The entrance. I ran. I've never run like that in my whole life. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. The floor rippled, trying to trip me. The walls bulged inward, reaching for me. The sound of the frantic heart was right behind me. A thunderous, apocalyptic drumming that was the sound of my own death. The iris was closing, a circle of daylight shrinking to a sliver. I didn't slow down. I threw myself forward in a desperate, flying dive. I sailed through the opening, scraping my shoulder and hip on the closing edges, and landed in a heap on the hot, sharp gravel outside. The iris snapped shut behind me with a sound like a sigh. I lay there, gasping, my body a constellation of pain. I rolled over and looked up at the pale, indifferent sky. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I pushed myself up, scrambling on all fours like a wounded animal, and looked back. The tower was exactly as it had been. A silent, black, featureless monolith. It stood impassive under the afternoon sun, giving no hint of the living, shifting hell within. It was just a thing. A wrong thing. I stumbled to my truck, my hand shaking so violently I could barely get the door open. I fell into the driver's seat, the familiar smell of stale coffee and sun-baked vinyl, a comfort beyond measure. The radio. I needed the radio. I fumbled with the handset, my fingers clumsy and slick with my own blood. I keyed the microphone. Henderson. Henderson, this is Vance. Do you copy? Over. Nothing but white noise. Henderson, for God's sakes, answer me. This is an emergency. Over. The speaker crackled. Vance, is that you? You're not scheduled for another 4 hours. What's wrong? You sound like hell. Over. Tears of relief and terror streamed down my face. Henderson, you won't believe it. I've found something. A structure. A tower. It's not on the maps. Henderson, it's alive. I went inside and it's alive. It's a monster. I was babbling, the words tumbling out in a chaotic, desperate flood. I told him everything. The iris door, the impossible geometry, the shifting walls, the heart. There was a long pause on the other end. The silence continued, filled only by the hiss of dead air. Then, Henderson's voice came back, slow and placating. The kind of voice you use on a spooked horse or a hysterical child.
"All right, Elias, just take a deep breath. The heat can do things to a man. The isolation. We've seen it before. It's called cabin fever. You've been out there a long time. Just stay put. We'll see about scheduling an early evac for you. Just sit tight. Over."
He didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. It sounded like madness. It was madness. I let the handset fall from my numb fingers. I looked out the windshield, across the miles of empty desert, to the black spike on the horizon. It stood there, patient and silent, waiting. It was almost mocking me. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what was inside that seamless black wall. But I also knew that I was the only one. The knowledge was a prison, a new and more terrible form of isolation. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood red. The shadow of the tower stretched across the desert, a long black finger pointing directly at me. As the darkness gathered, I sat alone in my truck, watching the alien thing that wore the skin of a building. And, in the profound silence of the coming night, I could hear a faint, familiar rhythm. It was the frantic, terrified beating of my own heart.